Now, are you ready to get your war on, Nick? There appears to be a growing conviction in the legacy media that we're headed for World War III. I noticed in Australia a story about conscription in Australia, mind you. We should be having conscription. They don't say who the enemy is. They don't say. It's just a general implied, we're going to go, we're going to do it anyway. So you'll have noticed that, I'm sure, Nick.
Yeah, sure. Well, you said, the first part of your question was over here, does it seem that the media have a conviction that there's a war coming? I don't think it's a conviction at all. It's a desire for war, quite incredibly. You think that after World War I especially, but World War II, just all these things, the disaster of Iraq, you think the last thing that anyone would want would be a war. But our media elite following, or taking the lead from the political elite and the general overall globalist factions dominating the world, actually want a war, and they want a big war. And so things such as the adverts for the video game based film and so on you mentioned, this is all part of a propaganda campaign designed to the atrocity propaganda of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, what Hamas supposedly did on October the 7th and so on. That's what atrocity propaganda designed to whip us up for war. And the things like the video you talk about are a sort of deeper psychological thing, which are designed to get young people ready for war. And it's quite insane. And clearly, looking at the headlines, as you say, I saw the other day a headline, conscription proposed in Australia. We've got the same thing here. It's a really big push. And throughout the Cold War, we never got anything like this. There's now a really big push to get young people psyched up for war and to create the systems to make them go.
I noticed that in the European scene, there's a number of foreign ministers of the various states, Sweden, Finland, the Baltic countries, and Poland, all talking about the inevitability of war, and that if Russia defeats Zelensky and co in Ukraine, they're going to expand the war out and all this sort of stuff. And it has a almost deadpan quality to it. But quite seriously, the idea of the population at this stage really believing this, knowing that technically speaking, whatever else can be said, NATO has an arrangement: if you attack one, you attack all. Yeah. So you can't attack, if you're Russia, you can't attack Finland and not expect to be attacked in return. So the idea that they would embrace an all-embracing war, we've seen one thing I find quite intriguing, the Polish foreign minister, Sikorski, ironic name considering how the original General Sikorski was murdered. Sikorski is married to a delightful lady called Anne Applebaum, who writes all these fantasy books about what's wrong with Russia. I'd also add to what you've said there, Nick. I think they're creating an incredible framework that they're somehow engaged in a holy crusade to preserve their so-called European values. But this time they're actually saying that they're going to be attacked. Which someone might suggest that that's a recipe for yet another black flag operation, that there will be a Russian tank division popping up in the middle of Whitehall. Is that the idea? You know, I wonder.
But like you say, Jim, who's going to believe it and who's going to fight it? I sent you a link a couple of weeks ago, Nick, to a young a European chap who discusses military matters, and he examined the British military, and he highlighted how its recruit base has slumped by something like 70% from 2001 to now. Of course, a large component of that is anti-white diversity drive measures. So the regular recruiting areas, typically poor areas further out in England and, Scotland, etc. Well, they're not joining up and they don't want to join up. But the biggest joke is their target for diversity, women, and, them peoples what are diverse ain't bearing much fruit either, because they sure as hell don't want to join up. They're Muslim division, they're Muslim division to go to fight Houthis. And that's another thing. Who the hell ever heard of Houthis? And now suddenly they're in the news and they're our new enemies. What the hell is a Houthi?
New enemies, that's right, new enemies.
It sounds like something out of
Alice. Yeah, indeed. Well, certainly the British military, for it's probably 10 years now, but it's got worse and worse. All really of their recruitment adverts, whether posters in the street or particularly the TV stuff, have been, as you say, aimed at minorities. It started off with black, trying to recruit blacks. More recently, as I think you mentioned there, it's now become heavily feminist as well. There's a huge push for sexual diversity. So we had there's been notorious pictures, in fact, in social media of recruitment stalls at various summer fetes and things like that, run by the Navy and the Air Force, as well as the Army, with not just pride flags, but now trans flags as well. So that's absolutely fine. I think the worst I've seen was the Army, back now 2019, they put up a series of recruitment videos about how it was for everybody. And one of these features a group of squaddies out on patrol on a rough moor somewhere, and it's raining and it's horrible weather, and some sort of half-caste fella with them says he's got to stop, and he takes off his boots, and he's washing his hands and washing his face, and then he's praying to Allah. And when a message comes through on the radio, the squad commander hushes it so he can finish praying, and they just all stand around getting wetter and colder while the Muslim does his prayers. Then he puts his boots on and they carry on. So that, of course, is guaranteed to put off any normal pro-British white working class male. They're not Christian. We're present in a non-Christian interlude in Britain, which we always have from time to time. But they still, the one thing they do know, well, they don't really know about God, is they sure as hell don't believe in Allah. And so it's almost designed to put off those people. And I think that's what they're doing, or have been, certainly up until very recently. There was a senior army commander a couple of years ago, videoed, and again, widespread point put out, saying, if you're patriotic, if you love the Union flag and so on, you're a racist, we don't want you, get out. So they've cut themselves off. And now, as the last few months, of course, all of a sudden, clearly the decision has been made. They are aiming to go to war. And therefore, all of a sudden, young white working class males are wanted again. So they're saying they've got to join up. The good news is that there was an opinion poll in Britain the other day, and 90% of men of eligible military age, which our elite are now saying is between 18 and 60, they're saying that we're going to have a citizens' army of men up to 60, and just incredible. Even in the First World War, I think the top age was 42. So they want all these men to go to war, but 90% of 18 to 16-year-old men said, "Hell no, we're not going."
Yeah, I saw it's very similar in the German case. The German army's been having a lot of recruitment problems as well, and they're not attracting the French army. Definitely the same situation. I know in Australia it's very similar, but Australia's not Europe where this war threat is. But I have noticed recently, it's not just maybe an enemy over the border. It could also be shades of, although it's a vastly different Europe, I suppose, shades of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, where the old regime, they would often intervene in countries with armies if they thought that there were democratic assemblies coming into being or something like that. something that might upset the kings and queens, so they'd intervene in countries. They intervened in Spain, I think about 1820 something. They intervened in Italy several times. They intervened in Hungary. And now, of course, where you've got countries in Europe like Slovakia, Hungary again, that are questioning elements of the war drive against Russia, there's a possible threat that European armies, they used to talk, you probably remember, we both do that thing, the Brezhnev doctrine, that said that the socialist countries only had limited sovereignty. But the European Union has created no sovereignty, effectively. So why wouldn't these armies intervene against European countries that were no longer going to toe the line out of Brussels? Would that make sense to you?
Yes, yeah, they're clearly prepared to do that. They're not quite there yet, not least because they haven't yet got a proper European army. But there's a growing extremism of the liberal elite. And actually, what's happened recently in Poland shows it very, very well, whereas you probably know, some of your viewers might not. There was an election in Poland recently whereby, although the right wing, and they're not, they're not really right wing, but they're slightly right wing, they're certainly socially conservative. So they've been against LGBTQ and against abortion, for instance. So a socially conservative, rather kosher right was in power in Poland. They had an election. That party still got 36% of the vote, as opposed to the socialist counterparts with 30. But the socialist liberals are now in power with a coalition headed by Donald Tusk, who was a European commissioner. So he's absolutely a Euro puppet placeman. And no sooner were they in power, they started the most incredible program of harassment and arrests and political and legal persecution of members, not just of the previous ruling party, but also, for instance, the main central banker who organized various financial things so that Poland's economy was improving and looked to be improving more under the old right-wing party. So the new liberal left have got it in for him because they think that he was, by doing his duty to try and improve the Polish economy, they think that he was favouring the other side. They were accusing the old party of packing the judiciary. Now, what the conservative kosher right were actually doing was they reformed the system whereby what was happening up until then was that the new judges were appointed by the old judges, but the old judges were the old communist judges. So although Poland had drastically changed, you still had its judiciary in the hands of the old far left. So the previous Conservative Party reformed that and changed it so that you began to get judges who actually reflected, in fact, modern Poland, which is a more conservative place. And the European Union went berserk about that. And they actually said in the last few months before this recent election, the European Union simply withheld vast swathes of money, which was due to go to Poland, in order to put pressure on the government because things weren't working as well because they had less money. And the moment the Tusk, this in effect European puppet government got in power a couple of weeks ago, the EU has unfrozen vast amounts of money, so they're pouring money in. And this was also said before the election: if you vote left, then you'll get all this money. So the European Union blatantly bribed the electorate of Poland to elect a liberal left government. Now they've got one, as I say, they're actually indulging in a purge and a destruction of the opposition. The journalists who sided with the other party, with the old party and so on, they're also under enormous pressure. There's basically, Poland is being rapidly turned into a one-party state in reality, and the European Union is actively supporting that. So when you get that level of willingness to interfere and to break the rules and that level of totalitarianism, of course, why wouldn't they use the army? It'd be totally illogical for the elite to go as far as they've done in Poland and then not to follow it up by also using the army, as you say, to protect our values. Because if you don't send the European troops in, then our values might be destroyed in Slovakia. So you're getting a stage, although everyone at present is thinking, well, war is coming, they want a war. There's every possibility in Europe that the war they'll actually get will be in effect a civil war between the European people and the European elites. And we've got that, I know it's rather a bit off topic, But in France at present, we've got a situation where there's tens of thousands of farmers with big heavy trucks and so on surrounding Paris and saying, we're going to starve Paris until the government surrenders. And it's not just the French farmers. This is going on the Germans, the Poles, the Italians. It's very, very widespread. And it's really, really militant. So the whole of Europe, I don't think there's ever been a time actually in history. You've had times where you've had this basically class war of some sort, so internal struggles, and other times when we've seen, like in early 1914 and 1938, all the tensions suggesting it's going to be a shooting war between different nations. We've at present actually got something where, whereas at the end of a war, like in 1917-18, you might have a situation where there's so much instability when you've got the fighting between nations and also trouble within nations, of course. But we're still in a time of peace. We haven't had a war, and yet we've got this distinct possibility of shooting war between nations and civil strife on a huge scale within nations. It really is something absolutely unprecedented.
Well, that's their problem, isn't it? Because it's the vagueness and the fact that in those prior wars, so the internet works both for them and against them. And bearing in mind the internet was a military invention, originally hijacked by the banking sector, but people are informed, more informed. Even people that you would, assume are anon have some idea of what's going on. Now, this doesn't happen. But back then, another thing that marked those wars was the inherent nationalism. But they've killed that. What their mission has been to eradicate any sense of belonging to a nation state or ownership of a nation state, so they can control it. One, that's going to make conscription pretty hard, because suddenly you'll find all these people pissing off back where they came from, and other people just, the general consensus just being against them. If it is to start as a war of Israel, well, the left is already, the new bastion of anti-Semitism. It's completely confused the dividing line. So again, I see it's not a fait accompli. And let's remember that the powerhouse that has to support this war, in essence, in Europe's mind, finance it, is not only fighting, picking up the scraps of its metal in Ukraine. It's trying to sail between missiles and drones, up near the Dead Sea up there. It's getting closer to it. It's to the ye olde neocon ambition of let's fight Iran. The whole mentality, everything is the last gasps of a dying, invisible and visible empire. So it's got more about the collapse of it. And I mentioned the two fronts America's on, but it's also now got a goddamn civil war pending between the open border there, which is just something apocal. Even Rome tried to keep them out, and that was one of the reasons they got sacked. But they now got an open invasion there, so it makes it patently absurd. And I would like to add to that, any notion of we're fighting to uphold this democracy, what Joe Biden, the Democrats' democracy, this democracy that insists that Donald Trump paid $83 million to some tart who's made a living off the back of great men, for not doing anything to her. Despite, you may take that monologue anywhere you want.
I'd be curious as to where European Union yesterday gave another 83 billion something or others for the war in Ukraine. They don't have this type of money. Surely not, Nick. They don't have these reserves. If you can give away 83 billions, you can cure the homeless problem on the street of Europe. And it's where this money is obviously created from nowhere. It's an effective tax on every person to fight a war that has no ending. So it seems to me that the model that's often put up, that war is the locomotive of change, is actually becoming true, and that maybe some cataclysmic event might only be a matter of a year or so away. Does that match any sort of analysis that our European friends are seeing?
Yes, I think so. And the financial question of can they afford a war? I think that's, in a way, it's very, very important, but it's less important than a couple of other factors. The financial thing, they can't afford it if they were going to look after their own people and sort out the various problems at home. But if they are prepared to put that to one side, they can afford it because, as you say, they're printing it out of thin air. So it's devaluing the currency. It's imposing enormous debts on future generations. It's running the risk of letting inflation rip again. But they can do it. It's not sensible to do it, but it's physically possible to print lots of money, to pluck it out of the air and print it, and then to give it to Ukraine or to throw it into wars. So they can do that. What they can't do is create effective fighting armies out of the modern populations of Western Europe, because you have to have homogeneity even before you can use propaganda to force a population to war. So if the hysteric propaganda is, unless we go to war, Israel will be swamped by Arabs and Muslims and so on, well, that propaganda would automatically mean that the majority of the street in London and Birmingham and so on will be against the war, because even if they're not Muslims, they're immigrants, and they automatically are siding with the others. As a matter of fact, I do too, but nevertheless, they do. That's the important thing. And you've got these groups who actually hate each other. So you can't put 18-year-olds who hate each other, squaddies from the Muslim ghettos of London in with young squaddies from the old, utterly neglected industrial areas of the North and South Wales. The minute they've got hand grenades, they'll be fragging each other. So you can't do that. Even if you get 18-year-olds, well, half of all the people, the youngsters who try to join the British Army, now don't even pass the basic fitness test to begin. And the basic fitness test has been halved from what it used to be. Then even once, so you cut out half straight away are the ones who want to volunteer. So you've got to assume they're the ones who are actually fitter and better in the first place. And then are at the Catterick base, where all the basic training goes ahead at present, half of the ones who get through the basic training, who get through the fitness test, are thrown out during basic training because they're so unfit, indisciplined, unable to become soldiers. So quite simply, they've created a population which is so unfit, flabby, undisciplined, unwilling to accept orders, that they're no longer fit to be soldiers. The only way they could make them soldiers would be an intensive program of renationalizing them, repatriotizing them and so on, and that would automatically mean they'd be even more hostile to the others who are in our country, especially in the youth population, in enormous numbers. So they haven't got the people to fight. And then on top of that, now you look at the state of Britain, and most European countries are very similar, that our energy supply, so if you're talking about fighting a prolonged war, you have to be able to create war material to give to your men and women on the front line. So that means heavy industry. Now our energy supply is now more than half of it is provided by solar and especially wind power, which is highly erratic. We've only got an energy grid because we import large amounts of energy, particularly from France, through one point at Dover, which is public knowledge. So any enemy would only have to destroy that, and we wouldn't have this energy coming in from France. We still produce a fair bit of our energy from a handful of nuclear power stations, all of them very visible. An enemy would only have to take those out, 3 or 4 of them, and our energy grid would simply be in collapse And you think the First World War, the Second World War, we were under all sorts of pressure. We kept our energy grid going because we had a huge number of power stations burning coal. And if there's one thing you can't destroy, even with a big missile, really, it's a coal mine. Because the most you can do is damage the winding gear at the top. But all the mining, the capability of producing coal is very, very deep under the ground, and you can keep on producing it. We haven't got any coal mines anymore. So we simply don't have the capacity to produce enough energy to run a modern industrial economy, even if we had one, in a war situation. On top of which, we're just in the process of losing our last effective steel industry. So what they're doing down in South Wales, Tata, which is an Indian-owned company, is closing the last of its blast furnaces, and they're going to open new blast furnaces with vast amounts of taxpayers' money. But it's not the same thing because they're closing down ones which can make raw steel, and what they're going to be opening are fake sort of electric-powered pseudo blast furnaces which can only process scrap steel. So we don't have an energy industry, we don't have a coal industry, and we don't have a steel industry. We've just shut down our last fertilizer plant because of the energy costs, since we're no longer importing Russian gas. And if you don't have a fertilizer plant, you cannot produce high explosives. So Britain is now utterly incapable of fighting a modern war, even if the people were fit enough to fight a modern war, even if you could conscript them to fight that war, and none of those things is possible. So the whole elite thing about we're going to have a citizens' army, we're going to fight a war, we're going to take on Putin, they are literally insane to believe it. Not just insane to want it, they're insane to believe it can happen. It's a very strange situation.
But they are. They are insane, yeah. And that's we can see that in their behaviour. I've also got to add about Britain. You've also got a completely depleted navy. I noticed there's not enough crew to man the ships. A lot of those ships are out of service.
Yep.
Yeah. And they don't have the trained crew to man them because of their brilliant recruitment strategies over the last 20 years. But do you guys, do you chaps, do you blokes, do you fellows, do you old muckers have the growing optimistic sense that Zionism is losing its talons? They're getting blunted. For instance, you know, in London, I'm sure you got Tommy Robinson running around trying to whip up the EDL old boys out of the pubs and gutters of around with a bit of old school inflammatory rhetoric. I noticed he's doing that, and we know why he's doing it, because otherwise he wouldn't, Mossad wouldn't pay for his cocaine habit. Gosh,
well, look, it's funny because we just published
satire because you plan on suing.
Of course. We just published an article like the hypocrisy of Zionism is absolute. And we have a major satellite city of Sydney called Penrith, and we published a piece in Penrith. There's a number of streets that are actually named after heroes and other things of the Ukraine insurgent army and the organisation of Ukrainian nationalists going back. This was done in the late 60s and early 70s. Now, I mean, Zionism investigates everything, and as the article said, if some local council here decided that Rudolf Hess was a peace warrior and they were going to have the Rudolf Hess Plaza, I could imagine the Executive Council of Australian Jewry having a heart attack and demanding. But you've got these streets named after Stepan Bandera, and set up the whole thing by a guy called George Borek, who's a member of the OUN and the insurgent army, an associate of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, which, as we know, worked for the CIA. And it seems to me that when it serves Zionism, anti-Semitism is good business. And obviously these sorts of people have been useful idiots, to use Lenin's phrase, very useful, and they've done their job. In fact, in Australia now we have a witch hunt looking for anti-Semites, And they were very disappointed that a group of Middle Easterners who were demonstrating at the Opera House here, and ostensibly they were screaming about gassing the Jews. And the police decided to arrest everybody. So what they had to do was get an expert to authenticate what was being said. And apparently Australia's top expert in voice analysis said they never said that at all. Now that's gone all around the world.
They were saying, where's the Jews?
Yeah, where are the Jews? And whatever that was supposed to mean, no one's saying. But top Zionists in Australia now are saying, oh, no, that's a threat too. But that's not what they said yesterday. They said that you had these mad people there calling for the gassing of Jews. And they're looking for anti-Semites. They're looking for anything at all. If you're an old fellow who came back from the Second World War with a German's medal on it because it's got a swastika on it, you can't advertise it for sale. And one of my best associates going back many years actually had a collection of that. He died at age 90-something, highly decorated Australian soldier. But he had a collection of all of that sort of stuff. If he tried to advertise that now and put something up on his website, they'd come and arrest him and accuse him of marketing anti-Semitism. But I think it's run out of steam.
It's running out of steam, but it's also, they've created a rod for their own back, haven't they? The laws that they fought so hard for, both in the name of local Jews and the Arabs they purported to be defending against the anti-Islam movement that they funded to begin with. They're binding them up from persecuting the Arabs as much as there's a bit of leeway, I must say. We've got a government sympathetic to the Palestine cause, at least notionally, right? So I know, but Penny Wong's still giving money to that Gaza.
Well, the history, there's stuff published about the history of the Labor Party over many decades, and its absolute fanatical support for Israel. The lunatic who was the Prime Minister here, Bob Hawke, you're hard pressed now to find
the American spy.
Yeah, he was a US spy, actually. And he's on record saying that he could understand, this is 1973, if Israel carried out a nuclear strike on Cairo, and he would consider it quite okay. I mean, these people are nuts, and it's run through the whole thread of it. But before I throw
I don't consider that. I just want to say I don't consider that crap okay, because it's like when Napoleon went into Egypt and started using the bloody Sphinx for target practice. That was uncouth of the man.
Yeah, that's uncouth. Yeah, but these people like Bob Hawke, you look at their history and their careers. He was funded by a very prominent Zionist who was involved in the transport industry, and he was marketed in many ways, and he's this saint. But he said this about nuclear attacking of a country because they dared to challenge Israel. But it seems that I was speaking with a Christian gentleman last night who said to me that one of the only battles that needs to be fought right now is the invasion of Christian churches by Christian Zionists, which of course is a misnomer. And this is one of their last battlefields. If they lose the field of, I'll misuse the term, but I have to, Christian Zionism, if it becomes a defeat too, then Zionism in Australia is absolutely up the creek without the proverbial paddle. So over to you.
Which gives me a question for Nick. What's the recruitment like for Jews into the Knights Templar?
Well, it's been zero, it is zero, it will remain zero forever.
Very likely. Yeah, sorry. So is this making sense in the UK scene? Is it very similar?
Yes, yeah, absolutely so. I think it's the same all over the Western world, even in the USA, where obviously the Christian Zionism thing is the strongest of all. Even there, it's very, very clear that support for Israel is in decline. And I think I'm sure you people in Australia are familiar with Monopoly. You play Monopoly as well?
Oh,
Yep.
yeah.
So you have to get out of jail free card.
We use it for actual currency, mate. Monopoly, mate.
That's right.
You have to get out of jail free card. And Israel and Jews around the world, whatever they've done since 1945, have had to get out of jail free cards, closely related: Holocaust and genocide. Whatever happens, show the card, you walk free, from a local criminal level right up to the criminal actions of the Zionist state itself. And
it has been.
in the last 3 months, they've simply taken both get out of jail free cards, Holocaust and genocide, and they've ripped them up and thrown them away, because no one, certainly no one young, and increasingly just ordinary people who either didn't care or didn't know or were a bit pro-Israeli for old reasons, millions and millions of those people have switched completely. And given that it's Israel now committing a genocide, it's Israel now committing Holocaust against young Palestinian babies and so on, Israel no longer has that card. And the long-term impact of that, God knows what it's going to be. It's enormous.
It can't be estimated yet. That's right.
That's something I wanted to ask you, Nick, and that is that, that classic bit of war propaganda about killing babies. They accused the Germans of it. They accused the Palestinians of it. Are we supposed to believe it of the Jews? I mean, I know something in me does, but,
yeah, of course.
Well,
of course they do. They're fighting a demographic war. Those people understand demographics. They've used demographics against us in various ways for decades now. They understand demographics. And killing babies is the best way to make sure there's not lots of soldiers on the other side in 20 years' time. So, of course, they're killing lots of babies. Yeah.
That's something so bestial, that they have used for decades in their propaganda. In the 81.7 films about the Holocaust that are churned out on all ranges of budgets every year, they do it. In fact, these great dates that we've had line up to mark the last 20 years in the new millennia, and that is September 11. I'm going to throw in January 6th and October 7. These 3 dates of completely fake, completely misleading, misinforming events that have served one power base in its interests. And it's an insane power base. One might ask, come to think of it, what the fuck have they got against Russia? And then you realise it seems to be a exclusively Semitic grievance that is being articulated, because none of us can understand it, for the love of God. No Russian done anything.
It's very odd, and you look at some of that Ukrainian nonsense, and we've been wading through it. I did a talk here a couple of months ago about all that anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations and World Anti-Communist League and all of this. And the Zionists were actually allowing the publication of booklets by the ABN talking about the famine in Ukraine, which was being blamed on Jewish commissars. Now, of course, there's an element of truth in that, and most of them were later murdered by Stalin and done in. But they had a license, those Ukraine nuts. I decline to call them Ukrainian. It's an insult to the Ukrainian people. We'll simply call them nuts from Ukraine. Are publishing this stuff. They had a license. They had to get out of jail free card to publish so-called anti-Semitic propaganda. And it's a lot of it's, well, we've seen the Azov battalions being pushed into the background and all of that in Ukraine. But again, I hate to say it, but a lot of this is very relative to what they can get out of it. One of our old members here used to say that the truth is relative to how much you can get of it. And I'm not exactly sure what we're actually weighing here, except one thing. I don't think that the effects of this crisis for Zionism, we can instinctively realise them, but the legs have not yet been pulled out right from underneath it, but they're very wobbly, and it's in the process of it. The big change is the left. But again, it's a mad ideology that's been given to the left. I've noticed the picket signs in the London demonstrations. We have it here. It's all about apartheid. It's about white privilege. So what they've done is they've actually turned the Israelis into white people in order to hate them. And that's a whole new... I'm struggling with this. You know, my fascist evil can't quite get a grip on this. I'm suffering.
They've done that with Hispanics. They've done that with Asians. But the big joke is this whole, critical race theory, all its similar ideas.
Now dead.
Yes, they have Jewish origins, and they barely shroud Jewish prejudices about white people. In fact, you know, you can the hell hath no fury, like like a Jew with a beard.
Like a Trotskyite scorn. You know, it's a crazy thing that they're doing.
The thing with Russia is completely baffling too, because what was the system that Henry Kissinger prevailed over? His balance, his global balance. There was a name.
Détente, the system of détente. And
well, not really. That wasn't it, but that's essentially what it was. Well, Russia was seen to be a balance, in essence. But that was communist Russia. What's their excuse now? I mean, you can't really target Putin with that. What, you know, is it some greedy coveting of the resources that he's got close at hand? I don't think it's exclusively that. I think there's a lot of venom going into wanting to pursue him. Yeah. And at their cost, because now, so you know, just before we were talking about how ill-fitted the European armies are for combat, that's also true of the Chinese. We're led to believe that they're this great emerging military machine, but they've been suffering from, cronyism, from all sorts of corruption, and they've too got soft soldiers. So if you look around, the few armies that are blooded and strong, they're the terrorists in the Middle East and the Russian boys, you know.
Also,
so we
should. I'll throw a one back to you too.
Spotfire tendency,
I have some belief that the lies that they pushed on the Ukrainian army, I have a feeling there's a limit to how many stories they can spin here. And the men that are being conscripted off the streets and press ganged into this army, there's endless chaos and corruption and everything like that. If I were the NATO masters, I'd be very dubious in the end about the Ukrainian army and the capacity for it. It may actually go, let's say, maverick. There's a limit to how long you can keep men. The First World War was a golden test, and you know what the German army in particular was like. And in the end, it cracked. And the Ukrainian army, I think, is at a cracking point now. And if it does crack, it might actually be a surprising result. It might actually be a revolutionary result in ways that the NATO people haven't calculated. And this is the point I was saying before, Nick, about the collapse of a lot of the Zionist certainties. I think we actually do live in a remarkable time that is actually transformative. And the things that are going on around us, a lot of us have talked about them for many years, and we've had to keep a jocular disposition or you'd go nuts, you know. But these things are actually occurring. And
this has to be the most upbeat discussion about World War III, I think. Well,
you know, I don't want to sound like Lenin and Trotsky, but it is a very changing thing, war. And the system has done a lot of a favour here. It decided to go to war. And it's now pushing war as its answer to some problem that it understands it's got. And it wants us, all of us, to fight its war for them. But mass conscript armies are tricky things.
Here's a more sobering question then, and I'll throw it to Nick. Given that they seem to, they're completely mad, right? That's number one. And they seem desperate to cling on to this oligarchical power. Their great plan, their plan with the WEF, WHO, and all the compliant little satellite states was to sort of reintroduce a sort of post-industrial, semi-agrarian serfdom again on the planet. From what we're discussing, none of it looks like it's going their way. Is the next thing nuclear missiles? Will they take it all down if they can't have it in the end?
Yeah, that's the great danger. And of course, you've got the Samson option as a military doctrine in Israel, whereby they've got most of their nuclear missiles actually pointed at Rome, Paris, Berlin, London, Washington, DC, etc., etc. There's at least some suggestions reasonably based that a lot of that's actually bluff, that the hard-nosed, sort of sensible Israeli politicians always use it as a bluff, didn't really want to use it. But of course, increasingly, the Israeli government is heavily influenced by millennialist, end-of-the-world religious nut jobs. So, and they're full of hate anyway, so I think they'd be prepared to use it. Would the liberal elite be prepared to press the button and blow up the world? Frankly, I doubt it, because at the end of the day, they're materialist atheists. They're terrified of death. You look at the way that Klaus Schwab and all these people, they're motivated quite openly with their transhumanist idea to merge people and computers by the idea of eternal life for them. Can't imagine anything worse, actually, but there you go. For any of us. But I think they're so terrified of death that I don't, and they're fundamentally cowardly. Liberals are fundamentally cowardly, unwilling to face sort of reality and nastiness. In the end, I think they would blink. I think with our elites, I think it is a bluff. They may well get us into a nuclear holocaust by accident, rather like the First World War. Basically, everyone's still looking at it, the historians are looking and so on. So in the end, nobody expected that, wanted it. They blundered into it. So they may blunder into nuclear Armageddon and basically wipe us all out, or at least turn us back to the Stone Age possibility. I don't think that they would do it deliberately. What they are trying to do deliberately is basically to get rid of us. We're the carbon they want rid of, to use the destruction of the energy-based food production and so on, to radically reduce our carbon footprint, i.e. our standard of living, and then to, over a period, if we're lucky, get rid of large numbers of us. So if we don't get rid of them, they get rid of us. So Jim said he didn't want to sound like Lenin or Trotsky. I want to sound like Lenin. There's a Leninist dictum which I believe that nationalists all over the world need to take up in a very careful way. I'll explain this a bit further. So Lenin's dictum: turn the war into civil war.
Civil war. Yeah.
We're going to create a war, so our job is to turn it into a political civil war against them. Not a civil war against the Muslims and the blacks and the Chinese in our society, because they've been bought in. One of the reasons they bought them in was precisely so that in extremis, the elites could set us against each other, so that the peasants with pitchforks take on the peasants with the torches, because otherwise they're going to come and burn down their houses. Or if the pitchfork ones win, they'll put your babies on pitchforks. So they always wanted to be able to turn the Christians against the Muslims, the whites against the blacks, and all the rest of it. The simple thing, the Muslims in Britain, I've talked to a large number of them because they see me on Twitter, X, standing very firmly against the Zionist aggression and so on. So a huge number have been in touch with me. We talked things through great detail, and genuinely, most of them, they don't really want to be here, actually. Increasingly, the West, although our benefits are very nice, let's face it, but the West is now so decadent, so degenerate, they see their kids and their grandchildren are at risk of being sucked into this thing. And actually, they, at least in their heads, would rather be back in Afghanistan, Pakistan, if those countries were decent. And they regard those countries as indecent and a shambles because the West has been bombing them and looting them for decades and so on. Now, is it just that, or is there actually, for various reasons, actually a systemic civilizational incompetence in those places? Doesn't matter, not our problem. They believe that they can make those countries basically a sort of paradise on earth if the West wasn't interfering with them. And so, therefore, they would actually, they potentially would be happier to go there than stay here, especially if if a serious government in, say, Britain was to say, look, sorry, there's going to be no benefits, there's going to be no pensions until you're 85, because the demographics of this country are so fucked up that unless we do that, nothing's going to work. Then a lot of them would want to go home. So we could, and those who don't, we can solve the problems between the different communities and so on if we actually set about it. We can't deal with the Muslims in terms of making a deal, which can be done. We could make a deal with them, but only if we deal with the elite first. So we've got to get rid of them before they get rid of us. And I'm not necessarily talking about through an armed uprising. I think at some stage they'll probably force it on people, as a matter of fact. But it's a political thing as well, to find ways to break their power before they get rid of us. And if they want to take us into war, as long as it isn't a nuclear war, then that war will actually break their system completely. And that is the opportunity for people of goodwill. And there's plenty of them, regardless of race, creed, or colour.
Well, talking about that, what is the migrant flow into the UK? I mean, I haven't been looking at X so much lately because it just it's rage bait for me. I end up impotently furious at everything I look at on it, and I've decided that's not entirely healthy. I will. What is it? Is this huge? Is this huge invasion still going on? Are they still taking them in? Are they still kicking people out of hotels and OAPs and vets?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, it's absolutely staggering. It's roughly speaking, in legal terms, it's they say the net migrations around 500,000, 500,000 a year. And when Enoch Powell was talking about it, my friend here, Enoch, there was 50,000 a year coming in. And now the net migration is 500,000. But that's because the best part of 500,000 people leave Britain each year. So actual immigration is 1 million each year, legal immigration, let alone the illegals. And then, of course, in terms of population change, you've got the differential birth rates and the differential death rates of the vast majority of the older population are, indigenous whites. And so it's huge. So of the 500,000 leaving, some of those are West Indians going back to the West Indies because they retire, or because they're taking their grandkids there rather than having them grow up as feral and very vulnerable trash in a big city. And so on. And there's some Indians going home. There's some Pakistanis going home, very often for religious, cultural reasons and so on. So some of them are leaving, but the vast majority of those leaving are Brits, native Brits, either retiring to, it's a bit more difficult post-Brexit, but so not so much retiring now to Spain and France, but retiring to Florida if they've got money, to Thailand, to Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and so on, places like that, or younger Brits moving abroad to various places. Australia recently poached a load of young cops, for instance, by offering them lots more money, so the weather's better in their heads.
And
it's a place, it's still a white country, unlike where they're coming from in Britain. So the vast majority of those leaving are actually native Brits. So 1 million coming in of them, not all black, some of them still are East Europeans and so on, although that's dropped off a lot. So a large majority are from the Asian subcontinent and so on. So 1 million of them coming in a year, plus the illegals, and 400,000 of us leaving a year, plus the death rate. It's probably a population exchange, you include the differential births, population exchange of something in the region of 2 million every single year. And the population of Britain, when I was at school, it was about 50 million. By 2040 now, they're talking about it being 75 million. If they get net migration down to 300,000. So it's absolutely staggering, the scale of change in Britain, which is another reason, again, why the native Brits will not fight for this country, and if they try and force it on them, there'll actually be, from young people and so on, I think, as big a reaction against conscription as there was, say, in Ireland, when the tail end of the First World War, the British government tried to enforce conscription on Ireland and built Sinn Féin into a huge force.
Australia actually has a history on the conscription question, as you know. There are two referenda held in Australia during the First World War and lost, and one of the slogans used, including by our later Prime Minister and leader John Curtin, if you vote no, you preserve what he called white Australia. I've got the trade union posters that were issued. Vote no, preserve white Australia. There's a clear link between conscription, war, and ethnic and other preservation. In fact, putting aside the fact a lot of people have become liberalised in our country, it's also true that a lot of people would not accept conscription. It's a creeping realisation. It's conscription for what? What is it that you want from us? And because the goals, when you hear people like the President of the European Commission talking about European values, or Joe Biden talking about our democratic values, you'd have to question it. And I don't think they'd raise an army here either. Not on their terms anyway. They would not. In fact,
another factor.
Sorry.
Yeah, another factor there, certainly in Britain, and also say in the United States, and the USA will be still the motor of a Western war against everybody else. And again, they're deindustrialized, but America was always so isolationist that, bear in mind, the Brits happily volunteered in huge numbers in 1914 to go and fight. They were actually really quite relatively happy to fight in 1939, apart from the Mosleyites. But the Americans twice had to be lied and cheated into World War late. And they don't want another one. And they've had the experience seared into their heads of Vietnam and so on. I was speaking to an American nationalist the other day who was telling me that there's 12 suicide deaths every day in the USA of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, which is partly just because the heads are messed up, but also because they are utterly neglected. We've got this in Britain as well. Everybody knows that a third of all the homeless people in Britain who aren't put into hotels because they're full of just arrived illegals, a third of them are former British Army veterans. And the fact, so there's in people's heads, there's the idea you get conscripted, you go to war and so on, you end up like the First World War in particular. That's the thing seared into our memory in Britain. Probably as Gallipoli seared into your people's heads, I don't know. But that's absolutely seared in, that it's really bad news to get conscripted and sent to war. The Second World War only reinforced that. And then more recently, the way in which the liberal elite, because they got such contempt for actually anything military and for white working class men in particular, they've treated the soldiers who got home from Afghanistan and Iraq so badly, and everybody knows it, that I don't think there's any possibility of the liberal elite turning that around and recreating patriotism and a willingness to go to war and trust in the government to look after you, to provide the land fit for heroes. So it's simply not going to happen. And I think one thing, we're pretty much out of time now. Certainly I've got to go shortly, but to sort of bring it around a bit more towards a conclusion. Because of that, I think we're going to see, what have they got to persuade people to go to war? Atrocity propaganda and false flags. And I think we're really, that's where the danger lies over the coming months and the next couple of years, that these crazies are so desperate to get us to war that when they find they can't do it, then they'll take to really desperate measures to try to make it happen.
Well, you're overlooking that there's a lot of children in the Middle East that don't know about gay sex, right? They have
I want to go to war straight away to introduce them to it. You know, like a marvellous thought.
There's not one drag queen story hour. I mean, how can these people be living in
our values have got to be extended. I'm, you know.
These are our values. They've never heard the word felching.
No, they'll learn it quick. you know.
Now, Nick, just quickly before you go, I saw a video on X, Twitter, and it shows you've got some sort of new sort of cop over there, a volunteer sort of thing. I understand, a volunteer cop. Yeah, and there was a girl playing gospel songs outside a church, and these cops come up and told her, you're not allowed to sing religious songs outside a church.
Yeah.
It's like you're sitting there going, what? What world is this? Have you seen it?
I've seen it. Yeah, it's a young, fairly dark half-caste girl who plays some lovely gospel music and so on. If you're into that sort of thing, and she's playing away with a portable Yamaha organ type thing, and this female cop, volunteer cop, because I think that although they're volunteers, they're still paid. So she's actually from Bulgaria. I don't know, perhaps in Bulgaria there is a law that you can't sing hymns, church songs as you call them, unless you're actually in church, but there sure as hell isn't in Britain. And now the head of the Met Police has apologised, yet again. But actually, absurd though it is, it's another example, and the way in which so many people reacted strongly against it. And most people, they don't go near a church at all. Even now for birth, marriages and deaths, they don't go near a church. But still, that sort of thing, the idea that you couldn't sing a Christian hymn, it really makes people angry. So you pick that one up, but every other day there's something like that, which is outrageous behaviour by the modern woke police or civil servants or somewhere or other. And every single one is just reinforces in our people's minds the fact that it's not our country anymore, that they screwed it up, that it's certainly not worth fighting for, and it sure as hell isn't worth dying for.
Especially with that video of the guy playing the piano in the London train station, I think it was, and they accidentally caught some communist filmmakers, communist Chinese filmmakers in the background, and they came over and do you know the video I'm talking about?
I didn't see that one. No, I thought you were about to talk about the video of Mr. Zelensky playing the piano with his special.
No.
Play it against him.
I wasn't. But these communists asked this guy, and that was his thing. He's a YouTuber, and he just plays the piano. And they said, "We are making a documentary for China. Can you please delete that video?" He said, "No." And at one point, he was trying to explain to the guy, "This is England. You're from communist China. We can play, we can film." And he just tapped a flag, and this like minder arced up, going, "You're not doing that." And the girl's screaming, "Don't shoot him! Don't shoot him!" implying that this guy had a gun. The cops come over and start arguing for the communist Chinese, even though there's no legal imperative for him to delete this footage, certainly no moral. And you would assume if you had a loyal, patriotic police force, none at all. We'll wind up, but there's a point, isn't it? The amount of treason in our own countries, if we punished it Nuremberg style, and I think Biden et al. Have to be punished Nuremberg style, right? I don't care. Him and Soros are like Davros, mate. The rope's got to come out. There is only one way to deal with that. Otherwise, it has no meaning anymore. It has absolutely anyone committed daily. They've just backdoored treason of the worst kind. Poor old McCarthy would be rolling around in his communist-fearing grave, You
don't need to look for globalists everywhere. They're in your bed, they're in your closet, they're everywhere. It's actually true.
Yes, the globalists are. Well, Nick, thanks once again for. It was a very upbeat.
I think it was a really good and upbeat discussion of World War III. Let's face it. When our elites are so crazy, so mad, so incompetent, so thoroughly evil, but also stupid, I think there's every chance that they're going to take us into something which will perhaps not destroy the world, but certainly allow it to be changed utterly and finally for the better.
I hope so.